That's pretty good, but that probably was practice, so we probably need to do that again. We'll try it one more time. Good morning.
Good morning.
I thought you could do better, and indeed you did. Thank you so very much. Thanks for being here. Thanks for letting me be here. You probably don't know a thing about me, so I think someone told me that I ought to share at the very beginning, just as brief as I possibly can, some kind of biographical report and statement. I was born in western New York State. I lived near Buffalo all of my life, so I'm familiar with cold and snow, and I love cold and snow, and so that's where I lived in those early days. I went to college at Roberts Wesleyan College in Rochester, New York. Then went on to what used to be called Eastern Baptist Seminary in Philadelphia, now Palmer Seminary, some of you probably know, and then on to Princeton for a year after that. The first church was in Chambersburg. Some of you know where Chambersburg is. The Chambersburg Church is no more. It folded and died probably 2 or 3 years ago, but that's where I began. Then we were in New Jersey, 10 years in Chambersburg, 8 years in New Jersey, and then moved to the Midwest to Michigan, and we were there 15 years, and then into Ohio for another 5 years, and then came to Lancaster County in January the 1st of '09 and retired. We had toured Lancaster County during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and so we have obviously actually loved that area. Always said that's where we were going to retire. I have a son and his family that live there as well. The second thing that brought us there. And unfortunately, 4 months after we moved there, wife Karen had very critical, serious cancer and died within the first 4 months that we were living there. And then I was one of those persons called a widower for 11 years. 2 years ago, got married to a lady named Nancy, who was a widow for 4 years. We all attend, Nancy and I attend what's called Westgate Baptist Church near the city of Lancaster. And she's back there helping with music. She's promised me that she's going to come next Sunday, however. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'll make sure that you know who in the world she is when she gets here. Married with 4 children, I have 2 boys, 2 girls, a boy in Lidditz, which is where I live in Lancaster County, a boy in Charlotte, North Carolina, a girl in Raleigh, North Carolina, and a daughter in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And then I think there was something like 8 grandchildren scattered amongst all of them, and that sort of thing. So that's who I am, and that's where I've come from. I was out of town. Nancy and I were out of town all this past week. I had to apologize for Jim not getting back to him earlier. Went back to Michigan to the church we served there and did a funeral for one of those sweet dear ladies in that congregation, which took us the whole week, of course, by the time you travel and you do all that kind of stuff. So we're fresh back from Michigan just on Friday and glad to be here. I have to tell you, I do not think I have ever been to this church in my life. I was actively involved in the Harrisburg Association all during those 10 years, and you, of course, were part of the Harrisburg Association, as I was in Chambersburg, but I'm glad to finally get here. I had to look it up with the GPS to find my way back, but here we are, and hopefully I'll find my way home as well. So, that's a little bit about who in the world I am. You may have heard the story of the 2 little boys that went to church. One was a church-going boy, and the other boy never darkened the door of the church. He was visiting his friend, and he was curious when he came into the sanctuary, and so the church-going boy had to tell him everything about the organ and the piano and the offering plates and the pews and the Bibles and all that kind of stuff. And he was able to answer all those questions for the boy who never went to church. And then the pastor stood in his pulpit, you may have heard this story, stood in the pulpit, took off his watch like this, laid it on the pulpit, and the non-church boy said to his friend, "What in the world does that mean?" To which the church boy said, "Absolutely nothing." So, now there's a clock up there. I think I can read it, and I've got this clock, so hopefully you and I, what time should we be done? Because we've got to do some singing afterwards too, don't we? As long as it needs. As long as it needs. Okay. I used to preach on some occasions at my wife's church in the Philadelphia area, and they were on the radio live, and so of course time is very tight. And so their sound tech man took a seat back here. This is what he told me. He said, when we come to about 2 minutes before we're ready to sign off, if you're still preaching, I'm going to poke you in the back with a stick. And that's what he had, this long stick, and he never poked me, but he threatened to poke me. I looked around and I didn't see any sticks, so I think I might be safe. I am not sure. I'm not sure. Okay, having said all of that, let's take a look at the text. We're thinking together today about a dozen roses. We're thinking together today about 1 Corinthians chapter 13, this very familiar passage about love. And I'm going to read it out of what's called the Message translation, one of those newer ones, because even though the words are familiar, I love how the Message translates this and puts this. So you can attempt to follow on your phone or the Bible you have, but this is how the Message translation goes in terms of 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak with human eloquence and angelic ecstasy but don't love, I am nothing but the creaking of a rusty gate. If I speak God's word with power, revealing all of his mysteries and making everything plain as day, and if I have faith that says to a mountain, jump, and it jumps, but I don't love, I am nothing. If I give everything I own to the poor, and even go to the stake to be burned as a martyr, but I don't love, I have got nowhere. So no matter what I say, what I believe, and what I do, I am bankrupt without love. For love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't trust. Doesn't have a swelled head. Doesn't force itself on others. Isn't always me first. Doesn't fly off the handle. Doesn't keep a sense or a score of the sins of others. Doesn't revel when others grovel. Takes pleasure in the flowering of truth. Puts up with anything. Trusts God always. Always looks for the best. Never looks back. But always keeps going toward the end. So love, said the Apostle Paul, never dies. Inspired speech will be over someday. Praying in tongues will end. Understanding will reach its limit. We know only a portion of the truth, and what we say about God is always incomplete. But when the complete arrives, our incompletes will be canceled. For when I was an infant at my mother's breast, I gurgled and cooed like any infant. But when I grew up, I left all of those infant ways for good. We don't yet see things clearly. We're squinting in a fog, peering through a mist, but it won't be long before the weather clears and the sun shines bright. We'll see it all then, see it all as clearly as God sees us, knowing him directly, just as he knows us. But for right now, until that completeness, we have three things to do to lead us toward that consummation. Trust steadily in God, hope unswervingly, love extravagantly, and the best of these three is love. God always adds to the reading of his word for his children his blessing in this hour. Before I come to this sermon, I forgot two things. You know, you get old, you forget these things. I noticed that you're doing Operation Shoebox. I tell folks at Westgate, it is my favorite project. It is my favorite project. I've done it for years in various churches. Westgate, where we are members, is doing it as well. So I'm glad you're doing it. I just love this project. Love this project. The other thing I guess I should have told you is that after I retired in 2009, for 9 years, I worked at First Baptist Church in the city of Lancaster doing pastoral care kinds of things. And then I retired again in 2019, and since then I've been just doing this kind of thing. Weddings and funerals and preaching wherever called upon and so forth. So, anyway, that's enough of that. But I'm glad you're doing this project. It is my favorite. It is my favorite. Let's begin by talking about this. Let's begin by talking about toys. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was a little boy, I had lots of toys, and I loved my toys. And I took very, very good care of them. I would clean them up, and I would line them up in certain rows and orders and put them in the barns and buildings I was playing with, because I just loved those toys. I would say to myself frequently, now take good care of those toys, because when you have children, you can pass those toys on to them, and they can play with them just like you did. And so that's exactly what I did. And then one day, probably 5 years ago or so, I gathered up all of the toys, all of mine, all of theirs that I had collected since, and put them in a box, and I mailed them to the son in Charlotte, North Carolina, because he loves that kind of thing, and he put them on display in his house. And those were my toys. Now, I have to ask you this very important question. Next week I'm going to talk to you about the question. It's Thanksgiving season, so we're going to talk about gratitude next Sunday. We're going to talk about the question, are you grateful? Are you a grateful person? Now, you've got all week to think about that and come with your answer, but that's what we're going to talk about. But here's the other question. The question is, can you keep a secret? I'm not sure if you can, but here I'm going to reveal the secret to you. Can you keep a secret? You can. Great. Here's when I was a little boy, my brother, and I have an older, bigger brother, when we were growing up, our parents always kept the toys, I don't know about you, but they always kept the toys hidden in the attic before Christmas. So one year, my brother and I did exactly what you think we did. We went to the attic, we opened the door, we found the boxes, found the toys, took them all out, played with them in the attic, put them back in the boxes, closed the door, and to the best of my knowledge and my brother's knowledge, our parents never knew a thing about it. And we all lived happily ever after. But I gotta tell you, it wasn't my idea. I have a bigger brother, he's bigger, he's older, he made me play with those toys out in the attic that Christmas season. He did. If he were here, he might even agree with that. Now speaking of toys, here's a sample, here's a list of toys. And when I mention them and the year in which they first became popular, you may say, oh wait, I remember that. Because I can remember half of these toys on the list. The second part, I'm not nearly so familiar with. But how about beginning with Crayola crayons? Remember coloring with Crayola crayons? 1903 was the year that they first appeared. And then there's that game where you got $200 if you went around gold. You got a get out of jail free card called Monopoly. And that came out in 1935, I believe. I don't want to miss these dates, so I better put the spectacles on. Remember Viewmaster, you put that little disc in and you press that lever and you could see those great scenes. That was 1939. And then there was that spring thing that came down your stairs. I think they called it Slinky. You remember that? Slinky toys in 1945. Mr. Potato Head, where you could plug all those things into his head in 1952. Matchboxes, 1953. Hot Wheels, 1968. Play-Doh, 1955. Lego, 1958. Ladies, Barbie dolls, 1959. And Star Wars in 1977. Now, I said all of that to say this. The thing that you and I want to think about in these moments together today has been around longer than toys, better than toys, of more significance and value than any toy you and I can imagine, because we're talking together today about this subject called love. We want to think together about this subject called love. A poet, Strickland Gilliam, Ohio-born poet he was in the 1860s, wrote and said, folks need a lot of loving in the morning, when the day is all ahead with cares beset, the cares we know and those that give no warning. For love is God's own antidote for fret. Folks need a heap of loving at the noontime, the battle lull, the moment snatched from strife, halfway between the waking and the croon time, when bickering and worriment are rife. Folk hunger so long for loving at the nighttime, when wearily they take their home to rest, at slumber song and turning out the light time. Of all the times for loving, that's the best. Strickland went on to say, folks want a lot of loving every minute, the company of others and their smile, till life's end, from the moment they beginning. Folks need a lot of loving all the while. All the while. So the second poet about love, there is beauty in the forest, when the trees are green and fair. There is beauty in the meadow, when the wild flowers scent the air. There is beauty in the sunlight, and the soft blue beams above. Oh, the world is full of beauty, when the heart is full of love. And the third said, a little bit of love can be like sunshine after rain, and cause someone, I think I need to, where's my button? Okay. Are we okay now? We are better. We're not better. I think we are. I'm going to go on because I think we're okay. The other poet talked about love and said, a little bit of love can be like sunshine after rain and cause someone to realize that life is not in vain. We never know how very much a bit of love can do, and as we cheer someone else's heart, our own gets lighter too. In February, early February of this year, in the Lancaster newspaper, the paper that I get where I live, they had a little article that said this: what do you think is the key to love? They wanted you to respond in 100 words or less to tell the newspaper what people thought, what they thought the key to love was. What do you think is the key to love? One writer said, love is the oil that eases the friction. It's the cement that binds us closer together. It's the music that brings harmony. This thing called love. The dictionary puts it this way. It says, the dictionary says to hold dear, to cherish, to have warm attachment, tender affection, and a strong desire for. That's what love is. The Bible uses this word, this little bitty word called love, some 450 times. If your memory is good, you may recall Burt Bacharach in his 1966 song and movie put it this way and said, "What's it all about, Alfie? Is it just for the moment we live? What's it all about when you sort it out, Alfie? Are we meant to take more than we give, or are we meant to be kind? And if only fools are kind, Alfie, then I guess it's wiser to be cruel. And if life belongs only to the strong, Alfie, what will you lend on an old golden rule? But as sure as I believe there's a heaven above, Alfie, I know there's something much more, something even non-believers can believe in. Because, Alfie, I believe in love." I believe in love. We want to talk today about love, and here's the 3 points of the sermon. Here are the 3 ways in which we want to look at that. We want to look at what the Apostle Paul says about love, and then we want to look at what Gary Chapman, maybe you're familiar with this book, his famous love language book, classic book, 20 million copies of this book. Gary Chapman has a lot of things to say about love. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to kind of conclude with some thoughts I have about love, especially based upon wedding ceremonies. And all of that, hopefully, under the umbrella of this title called A Dozen Roses. And if you can keep up with me and follow what I'm trying to say, hopefully at the end you will discover why in the world I've called this sermon A Dozen Roses. First, we're going to look at what the Apostle Paul says about love. Our text in 1 Corinthians 13 has been called the love chapter of the Bible. Some folk would call it the love hymn, or the hymn of love. Paul, the author, talks about love, what love isn't, talks about what love is, talks about what love doesn't do, talks about what love does do. Paul lists 15 characteristics of love. We're not going to look at all of them. We don't have time for that in these 13 verses, but here are some of them. Paul said that when you love, you are patient. You are patient with yourself, and you're patient with other people that share life with you, and you're patient with a God who sometimes moves very, very slow. Paul said, love does not store up memories of wrongs received. You and I have lived long enough to have encountered just a few wrongs. We've all had some painful moments, some hurtful moments. Paul says when you love, you don't keep a list of those, you don't rehearse those, you don't repeat those, you don't go over that long list. Love has learned, said Paul, love has learned about what we should remember and what we should forget, and how important it is to remember what you should remember, what I should forget. Love has learned all of that. Love has learned to trust. Life, I think, depends upon trust. We have to trust ourselves. We have to learn to trust other people. And we patiently have to learn to trust God as well. Love, said Paul, when you grow up, you put away childish things. Childish things. I love the translation. Someone once said, when I became a married man, I put away childish things. I can think of some married men I know, and maybe you can as well, who would do well to put away some childish things. And there may be a woman or two out there, I don't know, maybe she needs to put away some of those childish things as well. Paul says that when you love, that's exactly what you do. Here's some thoughts about marriage. Marriage is more than anything else, said one writer, the expression of love. The writer also said, marriage is a private commitment between two parties committed to love. Marriage is a deeply personal commitment in a public ceremony between two parties, between two humans. Love is all of those things and more, and you know that, and I know that. We've lived long enough. We've encountered and experienced love in various ways. What we don't want to do is what Blondie said to her husband Dagwood. If you read Blondie and Dagwood, you follow them at all. They're in their living room, you know, they're seated in their chairs. He's facing one way, she's kind of facing the other. I never could quite figure that out. But there they are in their chairs, and she's doing all the talking. I could figure that out. She said, and she has a catering business, you remember, and she talked about this one lady that came in, ready to get married, talked about the catering thing, got all the details straight. She said, my mother gave me this good marriage advice. She said, when you get married, you and your husband ought to go out for meals twice a week. And then she said, my mother went out on Tuesdays, and my father went out on Thursdays. Now, you don't want to do that. All I would say, please, whatever you do, don't do that. Henry Drummond would say, don't do that. Maybe you've read his little book. You can see how small this book is. Henry Drummond wrote a book on 1 Corinthians 13 way back in the 1800s. He called it the greatest thing in the world. If you've never read Henry Drummond's classic book, The Greatest Thing in the World, you ought to take some time. It is well worth your reading. Henry Drummond said that when we don't love, when we deny love or hold back love, we are going against the nature and the spirit of Christ. Paul closes by stressing the supremacy of love. Paul said there are three great things: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. The most basic of those three, said Paul, is love. Peter, and we read that. You read that Peter passage. Wonderful. A moment ago, where Peter talked about, above all things, show deep affection, show deep love for one another. So Peter and Paul are agreeing on the basic essentialness of love itself. And you and I should agree on the basic essentials of that love as well. There's a Wheatland chorale back in the Lancaster area. It's popular, and I heard him do a song 2 or 3 years ago. It says, love is as strong as death. Many waters cannot quench love, and the floods can never drown it or flood it out. Paul would agree, Peter would agree with all of that. If you're a sports kind of guy, a name out of the past you probably remember is John Wooden, the UCLA basketball coach. He died at age 99 in the year 2010. He amassed over 600 victories. He had a string of 88 straight basketball victories, 7 national championships. He was known for what he called the basics. And so one day he said, guys, come on in the locker room. I got to teach you one of the most basic things you'll need to know if you're ever going to be successful at playing basketball. They all took seats on the benches in that locker room, and this is what he said. Okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. Today I'm going to teach you how to put your socks on. I'm going to teach you how to put your socks on, because if you don't get your socks on right, your feet are not going to be comfortable. If your feet are not comfortable, you're never going to be able to play the game. We're never going to win. You've got to know how to put your socks on. It's absolutely basic. John Wooden was all about the basics. Paul is all about the basics of love. That's the first one. The second one is what Gary Chapman, in this book of his, The 5 Love Languages, what Gary talks about. He wrote this book in 1992. There were 20 million copies sold around the world of this incredible book. If you've never read it, I'm going to tell you some things about it. If you've never read it, you ought to pick it up. It's familiar and famous for what Gary Chapman calls the 5 love languages. The 5 love languages. It's a must-read. I've used this in lots of premarital counseling, all that kind of stuff. It's just an absolutely wonderful, wonderful book. Gary Chapman says everybody has 5 primary ways in which they know love. And what you should do, what I should do, is discover, first of all, what our own love language is, and then the love language of a spouse, if we have one, or partner, if we have one, or family members, or people that we know and love. Find out what those languages are, and learn them, and speak them. It's absolutely basic and important in life, he said. I've heard him give this lecture, this sermon, on 2 occasions, many, many years ago, and then just in the last year or so, I heard him give it again. Here are the 5 love languages, in case you don't know them. Here they are. The first one is words, what he calls words of affirmation, where you simply say to a person, for whatever reason, you simply say to them, you did a good job. You did a great job. Words of affirmation. Secondly, would be acts of service, where you go wash her car, or his car, or you fold their laundry, or you do something for them, but you perform some kind of service for them. The third love language, Gary Chapman says, is gifts. Because when you think about it, if I'm going to give you a gift, or you're going to give me a gift, normally you have to think about the other person and decide what would they like, what would fit them, what would be good for them. And so you were busy thinking about the other person. The fourth love language is physical touch, romance, and the sexual side of life. And the fifth is quality time, where you give the other person undivided attention, you focus on them, you give them quality time. Gary Chapman says, for most people, it's quality time. That's the way they most feel love. That is their primary love language. Want to know what mine is? Shall I tell you whether you want to know or not? Because it's not quality time. My favorite love language, the way I feel most loved, is words of affirmation. I like words of affirmation. I don't know what you like, what you might like, but for me, that is the one I like the most out of all of those. My task, your task, is to discover what our own is, and then to discover what our partner is, or our friend is, or whoever it is we're living with or sharing life with, and then learn to speak that love language. One day in the Christmas season, the pastor was busy preparing for his Christmas Eve sermon when there came a little knock at the door. Went to the door, opened the door, and there stood three kind of ragamuffin children. They weren't looking the best, but they had some good clothes on. They said to the pastor, "Pastor, is it okay, can we come in and look inside the church that gave us all those wonderful Christmas presents? Can we come inside?" He said yes. So he took them in and gave them the 50-cent tour and showed them all around, and out they went. And he went back to his sermon. 20 minutes later, they were there again. This time the question was, what time does church start tonight? It was Christmas Eve. What time does church start tonight? He told them. They left. He closed the door. He went back to his sermon. 15 minutes later, guess what happened? They said, and this is the most important, they said, "Pastor, is it okay for a kid to come to church if his socks don't match? Is it okay to come if your socks don't match?" I'm here to tell you, it's okay if your socks don't match. And I'm here to tell you that your Heavenly Father loves you whether your socks match or not. He could care less. He loves you whether your socks match or not. Let's come to the third and final point, and that would be some of my thoughts about love as well. Let's see. I want to talk to you about what I say about love. This third and final point is I need you to pretend with me that there's a couple up in front. They're getting married. And you and I are going to witness their wedding ceremony. In particular, we're going to talk about what I say to them at the end. And this could be you getting married or somebody else getting married. But I want to share with you what I normally share in the wedding ceremony, and I've done it for years, especially as we come to the conclusion. I give to this couple. I don't give them what I'm going to show you this morning. This is the best I could do. I brought these cheap fake roses just to kind of illustrate the point. When I do the wedding, I give them I give them 2 red roses. I give one to her, I give one to him. And I say to them, now look at those roses and see if you don't think those are the most beautiful roses you've ever seen in all your life. And they agree. And I say, here's what I want you to do now. I'm asking the man first, give your rose to her. And I remind him he's got no roses and she's got them all. Then I said to her, would you take the rose I gave to you and give it over to him? And she does. And I remind them, here's what's happened. 2 things have just happened. First of all, you have received the first gift from anybody, from me, the first gift since you got married. And now you have given to each other your first gift since you've gotten married as well. I gave you one, you gave one. The first gifts with real roses, not with these rather, ugly, cheap kind of roses. I say to them, I didn't get you a dozen roses, but I have a dozen words that if you will practice these dozen words, these words will keep love in your marriage or love in your relationship. And I say to them, I guarantee you, it will do this. Here are the first 3. Learn to say to yourself and to say to each other, I was wrong. Very simple. I was wrong. Because you and I are human. The last time we looked in our bathroom mirror this morning, we saw how human we were. We are human. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to make some intentional mistakes, some unintentional mistakes. We're going to make some mistakes. You need to say to yourself and to God and to your spouse, your partner, I was wrong. The next 3 words, because you said the first 3, you can go on to say, I am sorry. Some people have great trouble at repeating those words. I am sorry. They kind of get stuck in the mouth. they just won't fall out freely. I am sorry. But if you will learn to say, I was wrong, I'm sorry, it'll keep love in your marriage. Now the next 3 words, they just naturally flow. Because you've said the first 6, you can go on to say, please forgive me. Someone once said, and I tell couples this all the time, someone once said that marriage is the combination of 2 awfully good forgivers. You need to learn to forgive. Forgive yourself, which is very hard. Forgive the other person. Ask God to forgive you. Ask them to forgive you. You need to learn to be able to say, I was wrong. I am sorry. Please forgive me. I think that's 9 if I'm keeping track. There are 3 more words. You can probably guess the last 3 words. The last 3 words are the foundation. You probably can't say the first 9 without saying the last 3, without feeling the last 3, because the last 3 words, you know them. I love you. Learn to say, I love you. About that point in the ceremony, I poke the groom and say, they tell me that you can't say that to women too often. So be sure to say to this new wife, this new bride of yours, be sure to say to her that you love her. And then I sometimes will poke her or pinch her or whatever and say, and I'm told that men don't mind it either. You can tell men, you can tell your husband, I love you as well. And if you will take these 12 words, not a dozen roses, but a dozen words, it'll keep love in your marriage. I was back in Michigan all this past week doing a funeral, and I did a wedding in Michigan many years ago when I was there. I did exactly what I've showed you, exactly what we've talked about. A couple of weeks after the wedding, the family was in church, and the father of the groom, not the groom, not the bride, the father of the groom came up to me and said, Pastor, there's something about those 12 words, I will never, ever forget them. And I hope I don't forget them, and I hope you don't forget them as well. Those 12 words that I guarantee will keep love in your marriage. Learn to practice them, learn to share them, and they will keep love in your marriage. So then, by way of conclusion, let's think about this. It's in the family circus. It was in that little one of those little comic strips one day. And if you're familiar with the family circus, little Billy is talking to his mother, and he's saying, referring to Grandma who's in the next room. Grandma says she's seen it all, done it all, and heard it all. She just can't remember it all. I don't know about you, but I got that same problem. Sometimes I just simply can't remember it. Maybe you can't either. Here are the 3 main points again. What the Apostle Paul says about love is 3 things will abide, but the greatest of those things is love. Gary Chapman says, what I need to do is I need to discover love languages and speak those love languages. And what I have said is a dozen roses. 12 words that will keep love in my marriage, in my relationships, and in yours as well. Now, that's an awful lot to remember. So if you forget it all, that's okay. Just don't forget these last words of a little chorus. You may know the chorus. Don't forget these words. How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How deep the Father's love for us. How deep and wide beyond